that's precisely what they're about to do, I think, with overturning Roe versus Wade. But a part of this discussion that I think we've entered into, but I'm interested to hear your take on, is where the Democratic Party stands in what appears to be the impending overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court. Now, I've never seen a Supreme Court decision leaked before in my lifetime. I think this is the first time I've ever seen anything like this happen. So that's one interesting aspect of this. But the other part of this is the fact that the Democratic Party has, for years, decades, been basically negligent in codifying Roe versus Wade. They're scrambling to throw up a vote to codify Roe versus Wade. Now they don't have the votes for it with the two Republican lights in their party, but they're making such a big deal about it. And they're actually like campaigning on it to raise money. They sent out these mass texts when this leak was of this draft decision from the Supreme Court was publicized. Rush $15 to the DNC on Wednesday, asking people to donate money to the Democratic Party. But I got to ask, donate money to the Democrats to do what, Dr. Horne? Because I seem to remember Barack Obama having a supermajority in Congress back in 2008, when he could very well have codified Roe versus Wade into law and a bunch of other things, but just didn't do it. And now we're looking at the Democrats also exposing their ineffectualness as far as what the people want, but being really good at raising money on these issues that affect people's lives. So I'm wondering how you're assessing the situation with this leaked SCOTUS ruling and the Democrats kind of scrambling to do a bunch of nothing but, raise millions of dollars for what I think promises to be a failed midterm campaign.
First of all, kudos to Brother Akoli, and after being released after 4 decades plus behind bars, and kudos especially, I should say, to his attorney, Sophia Jill Elijah, who I happen to have worked with and collaborated with, particularly when I was doing more active legal work, and have interviewed her on the Pacifica station in Los Angeles. With regard to this leaked opinion, it's interesting that Roe versus Wade, the 1973 decision that presumably will be overturned next month, that 1973 decision also was leaked, although it's unusual, as you've suggested, for opinions to be leaked. I think that we should realize that the focus should be on at least the fact that this is not the end, that there is a possibility that contraceptives will be banned. There is discussion in Louisiana as we speak about charging women who have this procedure to be prosecuted for murder, not to mention the medics that assist her, perhaps those at the clinics charged with aiding and abetting, if not conspiracy. There is an attempt in certain southern states to ban these pills, which are quite prevalent in Europe, and I believe Canada as well, to criminalize the mailing of those pills to women. There is an attempt in certain southern states to criminalize women who travel out of state to get this procedure. For example, you know that in New York State, Attorney General Letitia James is trying to set up a fund to assist women in places like Texas to travel to New York for the procedure, and likewise in California, likewise, as I understand it, in Chicago, the city of Chicago. So I think that one conclusion that we should reach is obviously to have no illusions about the courts, an illusion that took flight in the 1950s after the United States, under enormous global pressure because of its atrocious Jim Crow system, had to move expeditiously to erode the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow. And so there was this two-step whereby you would decapitate the left, led by Paul Robeson, and then ease the more horrific aspects of Jim Crow so as to conciliate any constituency that might be upset by the decapitation of the left. And as it turned out, the Supreme Court was the body, the ruling elite body that was most advantageously positioned because of its 9-member population to move rapidly. Certainly you couldn't move rapidly in Congress because of the hegemony of the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, who of course then defected en masse to the Republican Party after you had the erosion of Jim Crow per the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And obviously President Eisenhower, a Republican, was hardly in a position to jeopardize his political base by moving against Jim Crow, and so that left the Supreme Court as a default option. On this occasion, with the release of Brother Okoli, I think we also need to have a very sober analysis of the battlefield that we face in the United States of America. We need to somehow not ignore the basics, the basics being that Donald J. Trump won the Euro-American vote, including Euro-American women voters, despite his misdeeds, too numerous to mention. And that particular constituency, which is less subject to being harassed, of course, oftentimes are able to turn out to the polls in higher numbers. And so I don't think we should have any illusions about that. And I think that we should try to develop an analysis that takes that into account, which, quite frankly, I have not seen to this point.
That's indeed true, especially since, Nancy Pelosi was on some talk show either this morning or yesterday talking about how, she doesn't want to defeat the Republican Party. She wants the Republican Party, the Republicans who used to believe in a woman's right to choose and who used to believe in people's rights to take their party back. She wants a strong Republican Party. And Dr. Horne, I feel like when we have Democrats in the political landscape, like Nancy Pelosi, who are quite honestly just coming right out and saying, the Democrats are bad, but I think we could do with a strong Republican Party, as if there are any redeeming qualities to the Republican Party that existed before these folks, the Donald Trump Republicans, came along. I mean, what is your assessment on Pelosi making that statement? And what do you think that reflects about the Democrats who continue to vote for this woman, particularly the Squad, to lead them, to lead their party in Congress?
Well, I think, once again, you have to look at the political landscape. To reiterate, we are living in a settler colonial society based upon class collaboration at its inception between and amongst European poor, working class, middle class, and the 1%. That particular alliance of class collaboration has held more or less steadily over the centuries. What has helped to shape that alliance and has helped to liberate some of us from the bondage of Jim Crow, for example, have been external events such as the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which put a dagger through the heart of slavery, not only in the Caribbean, but in North America. And then in the aforementioned 1950s, where you had the retreat of the more agonizing aspects of Jim Crow, you saw the rise of a socialist camp that was aiding national liberation movements, not least in Africa, which then in turn put pressure on U.S. imperialism to engage in what we can say retrospectively was a tactical retreat away from Jim Crow. But as of today, there are not necessarily political forces organized on the ground to challenge the Democratic Party, which is one of the reasons we spend so much time criticizing them, because many of us, when we look at Congress, we see members of the Democratic Party, we see members of the Republican Party. It's not like France, for example, where you just had an alliance between the communists, the socialists, the Greens, and the party of Mélenchon, who had got double digits in the first round of the French elections. He's a former Trotskyite. There's a possibility that he will be prime minister in France as early as next month if the parliamentary elections go well. But in the United States, we can only fantasize about that sort of thing. And that's what I mean about looking at the landscape as it exists. We need to get rid of these illusions about some so-called revolution in 1776 that created this grand democratic experiment, and recognize that we are living perhaps in the final stages of this settler colonial regime. And then the question becomes, well, then how do we escape the wreckage that inevitably will ensue from this final stage, wreckage that you can already begin to espy when you do a careful study of the U.S. intervention in Central and Eastern Europe, pouring billions of dollars into a proxy war, which bids fair, if we're not careful, to lead the entire planet onto the brink of nuclear destruction. So that's my particular take on where we stand as we speak.
And you asked a question that I've been asking myself, and I've been asking my comrades in organizing, and we've been, tossing about a bit, and that is, how do we escape the wreckage? And some iterations of that question are, what do we do? How do we build on the wreckage? And it's something I think I want to get into with you, Dr. Horne, on the other side of this first break, because I think it's really important that we recognize that the empire is indeed falling. And the question is, what are we going to do with the ashes when it does? But we're going to take a quick break, the first break of the hour, and we will be back on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. So please stay tuned.
By any means necessary.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Jacquie Luqman, sitting in for Sean Blackman, and as always, we're your guide to connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. Oh, yes, I am back. Sean Blackman is on leave. I am Jacquie Luqman, sitting in for our comrade, and I continue to be joined by Dr. Gerald Horne. Oh, and by the way, the phone lines are open, so you, my friends, can call in at 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320, and get in on this conversation. And Dr. Horne, on the other side of the break, I asked you the question that you had raised: what is to be done to avoid the wreckage of this empire falling? Or what do we do to build on the ashes of the empire after it falls? And I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are on that, because I'm not so sure that we on the left are very clear about the answer to that. either?
Well, first of all, we're in a very deep hole right now. And it's not as if you can smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day for 30 years and then show up to the doctor and ask for a magical cure. Life does not work like that if you have lung cancer. However, I will say that from this point forward, we need to understand how we've made progress in the past. And that is to say that because of the adverse political circumstance in the United States that we face involving this class collaboration between and amongst those of European descent, the 1% joining hands with the 99%, too many times that I care to recall, that what we've done is we've lengthened the battlefield. We tried to internationalize the struggle. Now, we've seen intermittently aspects of seeking to do that. I've noticed that intermittently there's been cooperation with the international authorities who've sought to investigate police terror in the United States of America. But I've also noticed that when the African Union and CARICOM had their virtual summit just a few months ago, Black Americans were nowhere to be found, just like when the African Union meets in Addis Ababa, as it will do shortly. It will be quite unusual for Black Americans to be present. And then, of course, we have members of religious groups. For example, we have Black Catholics. Now, that's an international organization. The Pope has spoken out quite eloquently with regard to his apprehension about what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe. I don't notice particularly any Black Catholics seeking to forge international bonds in that international organization. Perhaps you can brief us on what the Muslims have done with regard to forging global bonds and what is obviously a transnational grouping of about 1 billion people. But too much of our struggle is solely domesticated. Too much of our struggle is just doing what I consider to be a superficial analysis of the forces here in the United States of America, and then either bemoaning their inability to lead us to the promised land, or sitting on our hands as the roof continues to collapse upon our heads. So that's my brief summation of perhaps a way forward.
You know, it's interesting that that is your brief summation, because that is almost exactly what we heard in Cuba from the foreign minister and the president of Cuba, who talked about being in solidarity with, left governments that are targets of U.S. Imperialist repression all over the world. And they raised the issue of being in solidarity with CARICOM and the demand for reparations from the for the CARICOM nations, and particularly Haiti. And I thought that was really interesting, Dr. Horne, that the political leaders in Cuba made it very clear that internationalism and the defeat of U.S. imperialism is the imperative, not just to end the blockade against Cuba. And I know people are thinking, my God, she keeps talking about Cuba. Well, I think it was momentous that I was there and I heard from leaders in another country make clear U.S. imperialism in a way that we never hear in this country, and the danger of U.S. imperialism. We never hear politicians or any kind of leaders in this country talk about U.S. imperialism unless it's us on the left, right? In a way that connects foreign policy, the experiences of people suffering on the ground in their countries, and the need for international forces to coalesce to defeat U.S. imperialism. And it was interesting, Dr. Horne, that when the foreign minister and the president mentioned, they go down the list and they talked about how they're in solidarity with, the leftist governments trying to take hold in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and all of these other countries, and there were cheers throughout the auditorium. But when they mentioned, and we stand in solidarity with CARICOM and the Caribbean nations' demand for reparations, and particularly Haiti, it was practically silence. there was a spattering of applause among these leftists who were so excited about solidarity to defeat imperialism against these other global South nations. But when it came to solidarity with Caribbean, African nations, not so much. And I just felt like that was an interesting response and an interesting reflection on one of the weaknesses of the left, where we want to limit our solidarity to particular causes, like supporting, making sure that Lula is able to be reelected, or, ending the blockade against Cuba, but not attacking imperialism, which connects all of those issues and would provide the freedom and justice that we clearly don't have here. And I just wonder, having conveyed that kind of snapshot to you, what are your thoughts on how we deal with that aspect of the left, where there's certainly, clearly, maybe it's an issue of, maybe a lot of people don't know about these issues, but also maybe it's an issue of a little bit of racism going on in the left, Dr. Horne?
Well, first of all, the smattering of applause, who was in the room? Were these representatives of the U.S. organizations, hemispheric organizations, nations, what?
It was an international delegation, so people from organizations or just leftists from practically all around the world, South Africa, the UK, the US. There were people from the non-aligned countries, Nicaragua, from Bolivia, from Venezuela. It was an international May Day delegation.
Oh, I see. Well, given the fact that it was an international delegation, then what I would say is that bespeaks perhaps an educational job that we have to do, that we have not done an adequate job in terms of educating our friends and comrades abroad about the importance and salience of the Haitian Revolution, the importance and salience of reparations. Now, with regard to your question concerning the left, I was thinking in the first instance that this was a U.S.-based organization or organizational delegation, in which case I would say that part of the problem in the U.S., and perhaps this has been transmitted abroad, is that for whatever reason, and I see this almost on a daily basis, sometimes an hourly basis, that the enslavement of Africans is not perceived as a fundamental class question. That is to say, that these were super exploited workers working for free, who were part of an overall working class, but whose super exploitation was dragging down wages and working conditions for the non-slave sector of the working class. Too often, including by many of our people, I'm afraid to say, the question of slavery and its legacy is seen as a, quote, race question, unquote, not seen as a class question. You could see them as both. Obviously, you could see it as a gender question, too, insofar as the reproductive freedom of enslaved women was a key strategic controlling that freedom was a key strategic objective of the enslaving class. So if we have not necessarily educated folks here in the United States with regard to this critical question of slavery as a fundamental class question, that it infects and affects and has effects on all other class questions, well, then perhaps unsurprisingly, we have been not able to transmit that fundamental lesson abroad. So therefore, it seems to me that minimally, in terms of what we can do right here in North America, is that we can instantaneously execute a 180-degree reversal and begin to educate systematically and with clarity on slavery and its legacy, how the uplifting of Haiti and the uplifting of the question of reparations is a fundamental working class objective, is a fundamental anti-imperialist objective, because we're talking in the first instance about weakening the wealth of the imperialists in Washington and on Wall Street, not to mention their comrades in the North Atlantic bloc, London not least. And with, once again, the possibility of a victory in France with these parliamentary elections, and whereby you will have a former Trotskyist, Mélenchon, as prime minister. This opens up the possibility for international alliances within the North Atlantic bloc, not to mention the fact that in our hemisphere, Guadeloupe and Martinique, not to mention a few islands off the coast of Canada, continue to be ruled from France, which means that we have potential allies literally in our backyard.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm going to brag a little bit about my organization. The Black Alliance for Peace does this very important, deep educational work. So if you see a Black Alliance for Peace webinar, you need to check it out. We do this work quite a bit. Shameless plug from me, for my organization right there. But, you know, you did mention the French elections, Dr. Horne, excuse me, and of course the implications for term means, you know, more neoliberalism for the French people. I don't expect that he will do, as you say, do a 180 and reverse any of his policies that people took to the streets in France over. I suspect that he'll double down on them now, thinking that he has a mandate to continue to do those things. But I do wonder how you think Mélenchon as PM would be able, or if he'd be able, to mitigate some of those neoliberal-leaning policies that Macron is sure to continue to try to implement.
What it would mean, it would be taking the struggle to another level. It doesn't necessarily guarantee results, but it does guarantee a more favorable conditions through which we can struggle. Certainly with regard to bread and butter issues in France, for example, the question of retirement age, for example, the question of minimum wage. A government led by Prime Minister Mélenchon could go a long way towards reversing domestic neoliberalism in France. Now, with regard to the issue that we're most concerned about, speaking of foreign policy, once again, it does at least open the door to a possibility that France will become less hawkish with regard to the crisis in Central and Eastern Europe. I noticed that in his speech on May 9th, marking Victory Over Fascism Day in Europe, May 9th, 1945, Mr. Macron said rather clearly and explicitly that it would take, quote, decades, unquote, for Ukraine to be admitted to the European Union. Now, that's called kicking the can down the road. That's called, in a sense, putting a thumb in the eye of Washington, which, of course, has a contrary point of view. So a possible victory of the left is important, but I think as those who are involved in the science of society, we know that ultimately we have to look at the global correlation of forces, and the global correlation of forces tells us that there are no guarantees, even if by July 1, we're talking about a Prime Minister Mélenchon, and we're talking about a parliament in France that's dominated by socialists, communists, Greens, and other assorted leftists.
I know you said assorted leftists, but I know some people would think assorted leftists, and you know I'll take either description honestly. If we have if there is a parliament filled with such folks in France, I'd love to see that kind of thing here. But I think, Dr. Horne, this actually dovetails kind of nicely into the elections in Northern Ireland, which came out with Sinn Féin winning the most seats in the Irish, I think, Parliament, 27 out of 90 after Thursday's votes. And of course, Sinn Féin has always wanted Northern Ireland to leave the UK and become one country with the Republic of Ireland, to become independent of their colonial masters, colonizers, the UK. So are they one step closer to that? And how is the UK government responding to this new political power of Sinn Féin?
It's a crisis. It's a crisis, and as the saying goes, it represents both danger and opportunity. The opportunity is that it can accelerate the ongoing process of the once mighty Great Britain, the once mighty United Kingdom, of falling apart. As you suggested, Sinn Féin, which historically had links to the Irish Republican Army, got more seats than any other party in the recent election. Admittedly, not a majority, however. The so-called Unionist Party, the pro-UK party, came in second, and then you have an agnostic party that came in third. By agnostic, meaning that they're willing to go either way. They're willing to stick with London or split from London. And speaking of which, what splitting from London would mean, it would be like the defection of, say, Illinois from the United States of America. It would be a significant blow. Put that on top of the fact that Scottish nationalism has yet to dissipate. Recall the vote in Scotland only recently, whereby the nationalists barely lost in terms of seceding from the United Kingdom, a la what Sinn Féin is apparently seeking to do. And with a possible loss of Northern Ireland and a possible loss of Scotland, what this points to is that Great Britain might be falling apart, which on the one hand is a step forward for social progress, insofar as London under Boris Johnson has styled itself as being the sidekick of U.S. imperialism, in some ways more hawkish than U.S. imperialism on the Ukraine crisis. But on the other hand, we know that the imperialists and the reactionaries, they do not necessarily accept setbacks happily or blissfully, that oftentimes that makes them more dangerous. Oftentimes they try to foment crises abroad in order to deflect attention from their domestic misdeeds, and also in an attempt to get remaining nationals in Britain to rally around the flag. So we have to be on guard. But at the same time, a la what we were just saying about these parliamentary elections in France in a few weeks, I think that this provides a certain kind of opportunity that if we're scientific about it, if we're careful about it, we can plot further steps forward.
Yeah, definitely a development to continue to watch. But we're going to move to another break, our second break of the hour, and we will be right back on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. So please stay with us.